is Martin Edible. I'm the chair of the Faith Society and want to welcome you to the panel this lunchtime on Devo-revolution, what next for Labour. It's going to be a really exciting, fun hour. We've got four amazing speakers who I'm going to introduce in turn. Devolution is a hot topic at the moment. As you all know, the government has repeatedly mentioned their levelling up programme, which has been more rhetoric than clear action. There is still a clear north and south divide when it comes to infrastructure spending, when it comes to the strength of local economies. And hopefully today we'll get a clearer picture about what Labour's agenda should be. To my left, we've got Andy Harrop, who's the General Secretary of the Fabian Society. Prior to working at the Fabian Society and leading our organisation, he worked for Age UK and in various roles in the think tank sector. To my right, we have Judith Blake, who is a legend in Leeds. She is an absolute trailblazer, the first female leader of Leeds City Council, being elected in 2015. She, in May 2021, was elevated to the House of Lords, where she works in the shadow housing team, as well as in the Whip's office. And it's a pleasure to have Judith here with us. And to my right, we have Councillor Sarah Hyde, who is the current chair of the Fabian Women's Network. She's also a councillor in Islington and is a member, recently elected to the Fabian Executive Committee. She has an amazing wealth of experience working in the justice sector, especially in the realm of women's rights, and also she has a fountain of knowledge as a local councillor as well. It's an absolute pleasure to have her on the panel. And online, we have Martin McCluskey, who is the chair of the Scottish Fabians and has been leading our work and exec in Scotland and has held a variety of roles for the Labour Party. And it's a pleasure to have him also on the panel. So the way it's going to work, first of all, we're going to have short 5-minute statements from our speakers. Then we're going to open it up to the floor for questioning. And there with the microphone, he's going to be roving around. So to start with, I'm going to, first of all, turn to Baroness Judith Blake for some of her thoughts.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Martin. I've got this one now. And it's a great pleasure to be here and welcome everyone, either physically or virtually, to the great city of Leeds. And it's a pleasure, a huge pleasure for me to be back in my home city. And I'm going to have to behave today because I just spotted in the audience that my boss in the House of Lords, Lloyd Kennedy, is in the audience, which is a complete and utter surprise to me. I only spoke to him yesterday. I think he didn't mention the fact that he didn't ask permission to be allowed into Leeds. But as Martin says, this the whole area of devolution, of empowering local communities, the whole debate about place, how we put people right at the heart of the agenda was really a signature of my leadership here in Leeds, and a subject very close to my heart. And as Martin said, I'm now the shadow spokesperson for what is now known the DLUC department, which is the former NHCLG, is the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. So for me, this is really a two-way process, because we are going forward into a situation where Labour has to really define what is understood by Labour, even if it isn't our terminology. It's certainly our agenda, and we need to make sure that we've got a very growing and strong narrative that reaches out and engages in our communities. What we know is we've seen slow productivity growth and persistent regional inequality over the past decade in this country. And internationally, the UK as a whole is near the top of a wide range of indicators of regional inequality, known by some observers as the most unequal large industrial country. And although there has been progress on devolution in Scotland and Wales, England remains, I think I was quoted from party conferences saying the most centralised country in the world, but actually I think we are heading that way, certainly in Europe, and in terms of the developed countries, that is certainly the case. So what we know is still, despite the move to city regional mayors in some areas, that too many important decisions and decision makers are based in London. And I think this is the agenda we really have to address. And despite, as I've said, the development of city regions, and I'm very proud that we've now got the first woman metro mayor in West Yorkshire. That's a real breakthrough, I would say, for us in terms of inclusivity. We don't have real devolution in this country, and those of us involved in local government regard the current bidding process for funding as actually been quite obscene, if I'm honest. It's putting out that your deprivation is worse than someone else's, and then the real fear of political bias in decisions where that resource goes rather than need is something. I think my concern, and I'd be very interested to hear what people say, is that the debate has been characterised by division. So we tend to talk in terms of the north versus the south, the north versus the rest of the country, cities versus towns, and we've got to move away from that division and really bring everyone together to, as I say, to support a mutually inclusive agenda. And what we're anticipating is the government has decided not to bring forward a devolution white paper, but we understand before Christmas that they're going to be bringing forward a levelling up white paper. We need to be ready for the debate that will enable in the country as a whole, but certainly in both houses of Parliament, so that we're ready with our narrative and agenda, our demands of what needs to be in the bill as it goes forward. So I've been involved for many years before I became leader, and I have to say that George Osborne, regardless of some of a raft of his policy areas that we would vehemently disagree with, he certainly did achieve, I think, the narrative of the North on the agenda. And the Northern Powerhouse, although still needing more definition in a sense, but to be able to go as a leader of one of the great cities of the country to China, and with other leaders from the North, and the Chinese understood the Northern Powerhouse in a way, and that they could relate to the scale of it and the investment across the North. But behind that, we know that we haven't got the investment in infrastructure, we haven't got the investment in housing, the climate emergency is on the agenda at the moment, but also the huge potential we've got across the North in terms of the Green New Deal, growth in green jobs, however you want to describe it, is something we need to pick up on and recognise that the North is not punching at its weight, and we have a huge contribution to make the whole country, not only to people living in this country. So what I would say in terms of, 5 minutes is probably long gone, but we need to make sure that we, in the party, we really work to re-establish trust between national and local. And I think that's absolutely essential. The only way we're going to develop the devolution agenda is to make sure we have that trust. We learn from the experience at the local level, and that the party nationally recognises a need to let go. We'll have to let go of certain policy areas, but I would say language and narrative has to resonate with people's lives. And just in the 2019 manifesto, One Yorkshire as a model for devolution was in the manifesto. and I hope we can work for the next one of this year to make sure that it's in whenever the next election comes up. Thank you.
For those words, and yeah, One Yorkshire, that's something we can, press the, shadow, living up on. So we're going to turn to Sarah.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak to this panel today. So we are the Labour movement, and we believe in the power of people. We've always been the party of devolution, and we are the party that has devolved power to people. But I just want to say at the beginning that doesn't mean fracture, as Judith was saying. It doesn't mean, an end to the union. It doesn't mean pulling in different directions. It doesn't mean being dictated to by the Nats in Scotland or anybody else. It doesn't mean looking inwards. It doesn't mean things getting carved into smaller and smaller bits that we will squabble over, because we're part of that movement that understands collective endeavour of diverse people working towards a common goal. And after the last 5 years, in my humble opinion, we don't need any more like myopic isolationist type policies. So as a local councillor, I'm really passionate about empowering our residents and try and co-produce solutions as much as possible, doing things with our residents and not to them. So kind of micro devolution, if you will. And power doesn't need to be about control. It was an honour. I was a London Assembly candidate 5 years ago, and London is a unique, diverse city that clearly benefits from some level of coordination from City Hall on a number of fronts, things like air quality, violence against women, COVID resilience. We've seen the benefits of that being coordinated London-wide. So although I'm clearly a Londoner, my mum is from the Northwest, and so the devolution debate is one that I followed kind of avidly and passionately. And we know that devolution in and of itself is not good. It can be done well and it can be done badly. The Labour government devolving power to the Welsh Senate has enabled Labour in Wales to do things differently, things we should be proud of. That kind of presumed consent for organ donation, things like bringing in the smoking ban, progressive policies on violence against women and girls, the plastic bag charge. They were way ahead of the curve, and they were able to do that because of devolution. And as part of that historic move in 1999, they also ensured the gender balance of Assembly members. However, we've also seen the images from the Northern Powerhouse that Cameron and Osborne were responsible for, which was anything but a beacon for diversity. That sea of white male faces, all besuited. It wasn't really, a beacon again of like power to the people in the way that Labour loves to do devolution. So just because power is devolved, it doesn't necessarily mean that qualities are going to be automatically at the forefront. So you've got to keep fighting for that. And if good devolution is power to the people, then it has to be representative devolution. I would say that Labour devolves power and the Tories devolve blame. Okay, is it any wonder you've got Metro mayors like Andy Street and Ben Houchen being seen as dynamic leaders and helping out their area when Sadiq is restrained in City Hall in London at every turn? Central government starve Labour mayors of power and funds, and then they do things like, oh, look at Sadiq, can't even run the trains. And it's like, actually, it's your legislature that means that TfL can't do anything without a massive truckload of conditions that then have to sign off and kneecaps them. So devolution isn't automatically, kind of panacea and a level playing field. And the way it's being used at the moment by the current government is very much a let's get our tanks on Labour's lawn and facilitate those Tory mayors and traditional Labour heartlands so that they can look great. So after that whistle-stop tour, kind of where I think we're up to with devolution and what we can do well, I just want to think quickly about 4 things for Labour to consider about their future plans for devolution. Firstly, I would say that we should be pushing for greater devolved powers, a more federal system. We have examples on our doorstep, countries like Germany, that do this federal government incredibly well. We've got a map in this country. When we have the European Parliament, there were broadly accepted regions. People are like, yeah, I am in Eastern England, thank you very much. So we don't have to redraw a map. There's on a template that already exists, so that we could take a more radical approach to devolution. And as Judith pointed out, I too was going to mention the One Yorkshire model, which is widely supported by the sitting mayors as well. So I think we should all be pushing for that, for greater devolved powers. Secondly, I'd argue for consistency in devolution deals, because the current system is piecemeal and there are wild inconsistencies that I'm sure you're all aware. So something like Andy Burnham, he's got policing, he's got all the health and social care, Sadiq has only got the police, and then Andy Burnham has way more power than Tracy Brogan or Steve Rodden or Dan Jarvis. And good mayors need to be able to work across policy silos with this place-based approach with people at the forefront, because they can do that in a way that Whitehall just can't because of the scale and the locality that's involved. Thirdly, I think we've got to keep pushing about diversity and devolution. I think we say we have 8 metro mayors who include Sadiq, and there's one woman and there's one person of colour in that, and if you take Sadiq out, then there aren't any people of colour. That's a problem for us as a party and for our country. And if we're looking at some of those heartland seats as well, we need to kind of get real about this and make sure we're not fielding all white slates and alienating large sectors of the population. It isn't, there's great diversity all over the UK, and we need to do that in our representative politics. Lastly, I'd say we need to use devolution to innovate. That we stay being the party of good devolution and power to the people, and that we take risks and innovate to address inequality, so that our country can be the best that it can be in every part, with each unique, the unique flavour of every area, growing and flourishing, and not groaning under the weight of this kind of so-called levelling up, which is being administered by overprivileged men who literally don't know the difference between Bury and Burnley. I mean, what a flipping insult. So I'd say good socialist, Fabian even, Labour devolution, power to the people, through great devolved powers, consistent devolution deals, diversity in the devolution deals, and innovation. That's the kind of devolution I think would be a vote winner for Labour. Thanks.
Sorry for that, reminding us about how unbalanced devolution is currently across the UK. I'm going to turn to Martin McCloskey, who's going to be online, who also was a former political director for Scottish Labour, so we'll be able to provide us with some really unique insights. Martin.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks for having me here today. And sorry, I can't be physically in Leeds, but at least we can do things this way these days. I just want to start with a few observations, really. The first thing to say is it's for England to decide how it wants to run devolution in England. So I'm not going to sit here in Scotland and tell you how to reorganise local government in England. But what I would like to do is kind of do a bit of what I like to call the ghost of Christmas future routine, which is to tell you how things could go wrong if you don't engage properly with issues around devolution. And so, first of all, we're doing the right thing. We're having these discussions. People are really engaging with them. And that's the first way to kind of avoid some of the problems that we encountered in Scotland. And there's 3 things that I think you should be thinking about as you kind of approach this debate. The first is principles. So really going back to the first principles of why we are doing this. I think too often it can turn into powers for the sake of it in these debates rather than powers with a purpose, and I'll come to that in a moment. But on the principle point, the first principle point before we get into a discussion of devolution at all should be to actually ask ourselves, why does the UK matter? And in this kind of new devolved world, what is the point of the United Kingdom? Because I think that's what we found in Scotland, is that devolution has rightly been a success, and it's rightly become a strong and lasting feature of Scottish politics and public life. But in creating those institutions, we have sort of neglected the UK, and we have neglected those central institutions that exist in London, and that has kind of been at the expense of good relations between different governments. And as Labour Party members, as Fabians, as socialists, I think we do need to give some thought to how we work together, as well as thinking about what powers are best pushed down to more local areas and power put into more closely into people's hands. So that's the first point, and that really involves some of the work that Gordon Brown is doing at the moment on the Constitutional Commission for the Labour Party is really important in that respect. He's looking at how we reform the centre, not just pushing power down, but also how do we reform the House of Lords, for example, to better reflect the nations and regions of the United Kingdom. How do we reform the ways that the kind of slightly arcane ways that the different devolved governments in the UK government interact through all the kind of backroom deals and committees that exist? How can we actually make that a more public-facing statutory part of our constitution, really, those kind of bodies that exist? Wales has come up with ideas for a council of ministers that can bring people together. That's something that we need to be looking at. So that's my first point, is let's go back to the first principles. Let's think about why we believe in the UK. so that we don't lose sight of that when we actually start having these discussions about devolution. The second point is purpose, which I alluded to a moment ago. Don't think that just more power for the sake of it is the best idea. We've been through 3 rounds now, and we're probably into our 4th round of further powers for the Scottish Parliament. So, we had the original 99 settlement with the 2008 Calman process, and then we had the 2016 Scotland Act, which delivered significant powers over welfare and income tax, some of which haven't even actually taken hold in Scotland yet and are being delayed by both the Scottish and UK governments. So, we are now into the territory, for example, of thinking about employment law and other areas to devolve along the line. And I think in any of these discussions, we have to really, really carefully think about the consequences of, in some cases, breaking up UK-wide social frameworks and frameworks that have existed for a very long time. And we need to actually ask ourselves, before we do that, is this going to deliver the right outcomes for people? Or is it going to make it more difficult for us to do what we want to do, which is ultimately improve our economy, change people's lives, lift people out of poverty, all of that really, really important stuff that we got into politics to do. So, the purpose point, I think this is actually much better dealt with in the English debate than it has been in the Scottish debate, linking it clearly to economic outcomes, linking it clearly to social outcomes, devolving powers that will actually make a difference in those areas that are the reasons that we all came into politics. And the third and final thing, which others have already touched on, is engaging in the debate around patriotism and place. So in Scotland, the debate on identity is one that exists at a national level. I think in England, it's a much healthier debate that exists at a sort of local level. So these kind of regional, city, region identities that have then found a kind of political outlet is a much better way of doing it than trying to import an identity into an area that maybe doesn't exist politically before. And I think to do that effectively, we have to actually start by understanding what it is that people, why do people cleave to a particular identity? Why do they think that's important? And really understand that, and not try and pretend that it is always a problem of economics. Sometimes it is a problem of identity that we need to grapple with, and we need to take that kind of head on. And I think some of the work that Rachel Reeves has been doing has been excellent, and the stuff that she was talking about in terms of everyday economics at Party Conference this year really speaks to that agenda of linking identity, place, and economics in a way that can really be quite meaningful. I think I said at the start of my remarks that I'm kind of, doing the Ghost of Christmas Future impression here. But I think the difference that you have in England is that in most places, apart from some areas where the Lib Dems and the Greens are maybe slightly more resurgent, you're up largely against right-wing parties. But we also can't lose sight of the fact that, if we create new institutions, and I think this is something that maybe we forgot about in the past. If we create new institutions, there is an opportunity there for others to also take hold of them. And so when we have these constitutional debates, we also have to remember the party politics involved, which is, we need to have an agenda to win these these positions and these elected offices that we're creating. So there needs to be a kind of political agenda matched with a constitutional agenda that we're all talking about today. So I will leave it there, and happy to take questions in the discussion.
Thank you, Martin, for those sorts of cautious words and warnings. Good to now turn to Andy.
Thanks, Martin. So everyone in the debate on devolution supports more power, cascading downwards, power to the people, control over our politics. But it gets really difficult when we start to talk about the detail, the how, the structures. As I think most of you probably know, the Labour Party set up a commission, which Martin just talked about, chaired by Gordon Brown, to try and really unpick some of the difficulties that sort of sit behind the principles that there's wide support for. And I think it really gets difficult for 2 reasons. Firstly, because we have to get it right for the union. We have to have models of empowerment and devolution that work for all 4 nations and that bind us together as well as giving power to the nations and within the nations. And Martin sort of like started to touch on something, I'm sure we can talk about it later, but we basically need to have the right powers for Scotland and Wales, and slightly apart from Northern Ireland because it's so bound up with other politics, as we know, both Brexit and peace. And we need to get it right for England, both for England's sake and so that the power relationships within England work in the context of the Union. We can never have an equal relationship between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland just because the sizes being so different. So it's really hard. But the second reason it's really hard is because of the diversity we see within England, that there isn't a simple model that works wherever you are within England, and we have to grapple with that complexity. When we talk about devolution and cascading power downwards, we're actually talking about an agenda that's there to serve several different purposes. And again, this makes it complicated. Firstly, we're talking about power and agency in people's own lives and in their community. The community, that sense of communities being able to run themselves and change things locally, people having a sense of control over the decisions that affect their lives made by public agencies. And that's often a really hyper-local agenda that we've already heard about, sort of level of individual council wards, not even council in its entirety, let alone a city region. But then at the other end of the scale, we have the devolution agenda being about economics, about equalising the vast inequalities between regions and different towns and cities across the country. And that approach often requires a much larger scale of operation, where you're thinking about, sometimes it might be the city regions like West Yorkshire, but actually often bigger than that. Sometimes thinking about the whole of the north in terms of its infrastructure and transport needs, for example. So that's sort of like a very different sort of set of very different scales and challenges from that sort of grassroots community power agenda. And in the middle of that, we have the need to get public services right for every place, and that means different from different parts of the country. And I think a public services agenda is about communities having a big say in their public services, but also leaders having the ability to make the choices that are right for their area in their area. And we have an incredibly centralised state, as you know, within England when it comes to public services. Look around across other countries across Europe, of course, the federal structure in states as well. No one else does public services in a centralised way that we do. So lots of different sort of aims that we're trying to sort of crack with this. That's why it's so difficult and complex. The Valiants are aiming to make a contribution to this debate, and we've just set up, or actually launches next week, a new commission on poverty and regional inequality. And that will try to tackle, if you like, the economic bit of what I've been talking about. Very much conscious of the importance of it impacting on people's living standards in the fairly near future, and particularly low and middle income families. And we're specifically talking about poverty, because this agenda has got to work for low income families. It's going to work for anyone. And that means, sort of like an agenda that's partly about what national government can empower communities to do, but particularly it's about what both local government and city region government can do itself. So that will be over the next year, and very excited. Hopefully this time next year, our next AGM will tell you what we came up with. But we also, I think, need an agenda for the public services side of devolution, and I think there's been perhaps less progress here. When you hear certain Tories talk about devolution, it's usually the economic side of the debate. And I think we need to sort of start to sort of disentangle this. Again, I'm talking about England only rather than the UK. I think we need to think about how we want to empower communities and regions on public services, and what we want the sort of the England level of governance to do. I think that we've seen it through the pandemic, a big change in people's understanding perceptions of the difference between the UK and England when it comes to national government, because of the divergence you've seen and the negotiation you've seen between the four national governments of the Union. And I think this sort of takes us to a place where, if you like, we're ready to have a discussion about England-only institutions of, you know, sort of, I'm thinking about sort of, if like disentangling the structure of government between UK and England, that when we first set up devolution, just didn't feel like a sort of, it wasn't fixing a problem that really existed. But now I think people have got a much clearer understanding. There are some things that the Westminster government does that are England and some things that are UK, and we sort of start being far clearer to people about these England-only functions. But that will be, and so for example, it might be we have the Department of Health that is explicitly got England in the title, and some of those residual sort of UK-wide health roles sitting somewhere else, like in a sort of cabinet office or constitution office type role. And it sounds really geeky, it is, there's a machinery of power, but actually there's a really important political agenda here, because I think Labour needs to get ahead of the Tories and saying that England acts as a constitutional territory and sort of unit of government, because in terms of politics, it's well known that people who identify as English tend to have turned their back on the Labour Party far more than people who identify themselves as British or British and English. But we also need to get the sort of it right at the local and city region level, and I think that this is really tricky because of that diversity I talked about. There is not a cookie cutter model for handing over power and money in the same way everywhere. So we have to have a sense of, you know, so it's the opposite of the stereotype of failures. We've got to not have a top-down, you know, sort of approach to the illusion. In a sense, that's an oxymoron, isn't it? You've got to have it sort of shaped by the communities and reflecting how different parts of the country are, but not allow that to be an excuse for not being radical and fast in terms of pushing power down. And so boundaries is an issue. There will be, Jude talked about Yorkshire, and Yorkshire probably, you know, Yorkshire wants it should have it, but there are other areas that don't recognise the boundaries that the administration has given them, or aren't yearning for it. So we should give power to the places that want it and be radical in giving power. So, you know, I think in principle, Yorkshire or Greater Manchester should be given the powers over public services that exist in Whitehall at the moment. The size of those big regions is more than enough to run a school system, more than enough to run a health and care system, and they need the money to do it as well. So I would argue, not everywhere, but in places that want it and are ready for it, they should have the entire public service budget devolved to them to make the choices about how they spend it. And let's see what happens. You know, see what happens in 1, 2, 3 parts of the country, and allow that to be a journey that others can come on to afterwards if they wish to. The final thing that we really need to grapple with, and is really difficult, is money. We have an incredibly centralised tax and spend system in this country, just as we have when it comes to law and powers. And it's really difficult to cope with, because, you know, whenever you sort of start to make changes, someone's a loser on money. But I totally agree with previous comments that we need to have a federal approach to how to have a distribution of money and tax raising as well. The detail will have to follow. It will be difficult to get it right, but other countries do it. Australia does it. Germany does it. They have lots of local taxes. They have national taxes, and they have a federal system for how you share it out with independence, rather than it just being a politicized sort of minister-led process. I think, again, we need to start that discussion now so that we have a clear offer for people that is both politically positive. You know, in some parts of the country, it would be a really good thing that people want to vote for, but we've also dealt with the potential negatives, so we don't have the parts of the country that are less keen on fast devolution, so it being whipped up as something to take against us, as in some parts of the country it has been in the Labour era of devolution, where there were complaints in some places just as it was popular in others. Thank you.
you, Andy. That's great. You know, lots of thought there. Federalisation, regional tax raising. Now we're going to turn to the Q&A portion. First of all, we're going to take a round of 3 questions from the room before we go online. So I can see some hands shot raised there. So we've got the chap over there, you next, and one more hand. Yeah, and the lady over there. And before, could you introduce yourself with your name and where you're from? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sheriff Rushton. I'm chair of the York Favourite Society from York. I'm also an ex-councillor. I just wanted to talk about the battle that we've had in York. Because this government tried to make York, as a unitary authority, take on areas in Rydale and lump us together with Harrogate, which really the people that expressed views when we were allowed to said no, this is taking away our identity. We are fully capable of a unitary authority to manage our affairs because we take in a very, very diverse area. I mean, it was bad enough when the parliamentary seats divided, and I represented one of the area which took in Julian Sturvey as its MP, Tory MP. So one of the odd seats that was there, it did not have then Hugh Bailey and now Rachel Maskell, both excellent MPs, and people, constituents were very miffed, to say the least, that they'd lost the York Central. And then lastly, there's a crazy attempt by some Lib Dems to make a small area of York a town, which, in case you don't know, it's Acomb, is what they're looking at. Which is a very nice area, but it takes in 2 electoral wards, completely different. So you've got Acomb itself, and then you've got Holgate. And I don't think there's a majority for it, but nevertheless they push and push and push. And I fear they come to just wasting money as well as yet another layer of government. And this is not what people want. So thanks very much for listening.
No worries.
Good afternoon, Andrew Edwards. I just want to explore with Judith about just what your plans are for bidding. Now, if I was running Leeds City Council, I wouldn't have bid any of the Channel 4 bounty. I think that bidding is detrimental. It can create good ideas in the sense of you get some thinking, but nevertheless, I represented Tidworth, a big army garrison town. It was constantly told how depressed it was full of army families and everything like that. Well, no wonder you feel depressed when you're constantly told you're in a depressed area. Right? So I'm fascinated by your thinking on what the future Labour government will do, is try and escape from the bidding system, because places like Richmond in Yorkshire would by any definition not be in a poor area when you look at how relatively speaking well off it is, and yet it happened to have the Chancellor as a member of Parliament is successful. But Labour have got a habit, or could have a habit, unless you're telling me different, they have got some other thinking on how to get rid of the bidding system. And then finally, just to contribute to Andrew's about British identity, yes, my contribution would be let's abolish the name the Bank of England, because it's detrimental to the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish, and turn it into the United Kingdom Central Bank, which is what it is.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Laura. I'm a councillor from County Durham. I've got a couple of questions. The first is, I don't think that I've heard people talk about skills very much today, and for us in the North East, skills is one of the biggest factors and the skills deficit that holds back our economy. And what we often find is that we get strategies coming out of Whitehall to talk about the economy, and they talk about transport, but actually what they don't match up with is any kind of skills strategy that would actually unlock the potential of the strategies they come up with. And the second is, in County Durham, if we were still a member of the European Union, we'd be going into out of the transition areas of we would no longer be a transition region for EU funding. We'd be in the most deprived, underdeveloped regions in this EU Parliament, and we were due to get even more money from the EU, but the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is meant to be replacing that funding, doesn't seem to be working on the kind of needs-based model that we need it to. In fact, it seems to be lining the pockets of constituencies that are represented by Tory cabinet ministers. That's massively detrimental to us. We've got 3 Tory MPs in County Durham, and after the Cheshire and Amersham by-election, one of them wrote a piece in Conservative Home saying that levelling up was just as much about Ashford as Ashington. Clearly they don't care about the North East and they're just pretending. So what's Labour doing nationally to hold them to account and hold the government to account over the lies told about shared prosperity?
Thank you. Some phenomenal questions. Just to recap Gerard's question about, when is devolution a bit too much, Andrew on the bidding system, and Laura about the skills deficit, and also a question linked also seemed to Andrew about the shared prosperity fund. So what I want to do is first of all start with Sarah.
Thank you. I just want to speak very briefly. It wasn't Andrew's question about bidding, but you mentioned the web. I think we are really bad as a party at talking areas down or describing areas negatively. And we've been working on something where I am with it's called asset-based community development, which is a ridiculous title for something that's very straightforward. And it's about helping communities talk about what is strong and not about what is wrong with a place. And so I like to talk about that everywhere I go, because narrative matters, it's really important. And I think there are parts of the country that we're talking about today, like I'm obviously not from the North East, but there's parts of the North East where there's 5 things I can immediately think about Stockton that I want to talk about what is strong, brilliant, because I'm a friend of Jessie Jo Jacobs, wherever she goes, so then tells everyone what's brilliant about Stockton, and when you go there, you get to see the highlights. And I think there are things like that we can be doing that reframe how our party talks about some of the areas of the country that most needs devolution deals. It doesn't just look like a load of London idiots like me coming in and saying, oh, this is what's wrong, because it's not helpful. Do you know what I mean? We need to be working together and putting our shoulder to the wheel to A, to listen, and B, to help tell those stories together. I'm not an expert on bidding, but I wanted to comment on that element of things. The post-EU settlement stuff, it's just a nightmare, isn't it? I think it would be really helpful if kind of Lotto and Party Centrally as well could keep thinking about how do we keep this in the public eye, because the people that are living in those areas, it's catastrophic. The impact, and obviously we know that map that the people that often, the areas that benefit the most from EU funding are the areas that voted most for Brexit in different parts of the country. And so how do we, what is the most compelling way to keep communicating the devastation without being accused of we'll just totally hung up on the 2016 referendum, but to expose the kind of Tory lies and the way that they're misusing that and misrepresenting that. And that's kind of why I mentioned people like Ellen Houchin and Andy Street in my short speech, is because it's no surprise they want with increased majorities, because even the canny, sometimes Labour voters in those areas, when I was phone canvassing in those areas, are like, well, I am Labour, but I'm going to vote for them because he's got a year of government and they're going to give him some more money. And that was very difficult to argue with. So I think there's a challenge for someone to be working on. I'm sorry, I don't have a more positive response to that. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. And just returning to you, Judith, as a member of the Shadow Housing Community Local Government team, question there on bidding and also on the shared prosperity fund and skills deficit, it'd be great to get your views on that.
Can I just answer the York issue? Whether the place to be able to do that, and actually it was because of the situation of cities like York that we collectively moved to a one Yorkshire model, because we were given a cookie cutting model, and we were told it had to be West Yorkshire. We couldn't go into our area that's covered by the LEP, the functioning economic area, which includes 3 districts in North Yorkshire, and a fantastic relationship actually with you as a partner, and we just weren't allowed to do that. And we, in the end, because the tap was being turned off in terms of the resource community, we had to compromise and like go to the West Yorkshire model. But it is that recognition that York is unique, And I'm intrigued to see how the devolution deal that you're being moved forward actually comes to pass. Huge sympathy for the position in York. So through the discussions around leaving Europe, we always knew the difficulty that would come from how the government decided to redistribute the shared responsibility fund. I think that's the real concern. And we knew if it was absorbed back into the centre into Whitehall and redistributed through the really unfair formulas that exist at the moment, then all of the principles around that targeted EU funding would go, and the EU funding did target huge amounts of resource into areas of need, and also worked on a longer time frame. And I think that's the other issue that we have to get to, because at the moment funding is just being skewed towards the electoral cycle of whichever government is in place, and the entrenched issues that we're talking about, we're going to need a really long-term model. But I think this is probably something that Andy's commission could pick up and look at very carefully in terms of how we do come up with formula that work for local areas, how then that moves into being able to have entities that resource can be devolved down to, with the trust that can be delivered in a way that responds to local priorities. I wasn't quite sure about your Channel 4 reference, because actually the Channel 4 process enabled us to demonstrate the potential of Leeds and the wider West Yorkshire region in a way that surprised the other bidding areas in the country. That can be absolutely brutal. They didn't recognise what we were being able to put on the table. And just to say that links very clearly to Laura's point about skills and skills. We have to keep repeating it, you're right, but it is so entrenched in our thinking about, if there's one thing that we need to really shift, it's the approach to how we get the, not just skills, but the whole education system. I remember going to Berlin when I had the education portfolio, and naively asking the minister or whatever in Berlin about their relationship with the national government, and he looked at me as if my lights had gone out and said, "We don't have one. We don't have a national education department. It's all federalised." And it was such an interesting thing for me. But yes, absolutely. But I would say, you know, the ludicrous situation we've got at the moment where Whitehall, through the Department for Education, is trying to run individual schools through its academy programme. Surely that is an area that, as Labour politicians, we have to get hold of and look forward for the benefit of not just young people, because skills spans up all generations. And that's very interesting.
Thank you, Judith. Before I turn to Martin and Virtuous, I want to turn to you, Andy, to get your thoughts.
Thanks, Martin. So I think skills is just such a brilliant example of the potential of devolution. That, you know, I know there's some areas that have had some skills housing funding given to them, but the reason it's really, you know, it's huge. Firstly, it's so integrated into other areas of policy, and one of the best reasons to give power, to cascade power downwards, is that it's local decision makers who can do the joining up far better than those siloed national departments. So that you've got a skills agenda and skills funding aligned with what you're doing on the rest of the economy and transport and employment policy, and where you just don't have a UK or England level. It is, however, an area, it demonstrates some of the complexity I was talking about. So I think, as I said earlier, if areas want it and can do it, they should have all the public service funding given to them, and they decide how much they should go on adult skills as opposed to early years or health and social care. Why should that decision be made by ministers? But there are also roles that national government must play. And I think skills is a really good example. So particularly, what's the responsibility of employers on the skills agenda? Because most money for adult training is spent by employers, not the state. And that will always be something that national government needs to be involved in, you know, particularly when it comes to regulating and tax. So we can't just say, a full federal model, pass everything down to regions or communities. We need to think about what's the interplay, what's the right balance between what happens in Westminster and what happens elsewhere. And I also just want to talk briefly about funding and allocations, and it just makes me so angry what's been happening. There's two things going on. There is corruption. There is corruption when it comes to ultra politicized decisions about the allocation of some of these funds. The Shared Prosperity Fund we talk about, but the Towns Fund is and you should go and read this National Audit Office report, and they're sort of the most dry accountants you ever come across. They never criticise the government, but they read between the lines their analysis of how Towns Fund funding was allocated just before the last election. It's corruption. But there's also a more subtle process of how all those both the individual pots but just general public service funding, the money is skewed through the clever use of formula towards people the Tories want to benefit. So, in terms of, it used to be North versus South, but now it's much more like cities versus towns, so making sure that, their electoral priorities or their communities are getting better, which, linked back to Shared Prosperity Fund, it means that the places that need money most to move forward economically will be starved of it. And your example of Canterbury being a really good case in point. Now, I'm not so naive that I don't think that politicians will always have a bit of politics in their thinking when they make these allocation formula. But that's why I want something that, if you like, I talked about sort of federal spending commission type processes. That sort of makes the politics a bit more sort of in the open. So you have it being broken by different political things sort of horizontally, sort of having to make their case rather than it just being all behind closed doors, smoke and mirrors, government ministers decide what they want.
Thank you, Andy. I just want to turn to Martin to get his view, not only from the Scottish perspective, but outside looking in.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I don't have a huge amount to add to some of these questions, but I'll just pick up on just where Andy kind of stopped there, which is around this whole post-EU settlement and how the UK funding mechanisms work. Now, from an English point of view, this is obviously causing a lot of issues that the panel have rehearsed well. I think people aren't maybe really seeing the strain that it's putting on the whole of the UK. So the UK Internal Market Bill, which was passed last year and devised a lot of these systems for allocating funding, just ran roughshod over devolution. So while again, there's obviously we're having a really vibrant debate about devolution in England, what the process for post-EU funding actually did in Scotland was to reserve power back to the UK government to use their power in devolved areas, and that ended up with we end up with the situation in the budget a few weeks ago where the UK government was using its power to fund things like new shopping centres in Scotland. Now that kind of investment in local areas is welcome. Of course, no one's going to argue with that. But is it really for the UK government sat in London to be deciding that a new shopping centre should get £19 million in the west of Scotland? It just seems like an odd reversal of devolution. So I think that one of the things that we all need to keep our eye on. And it is this kind of re-centralisation of power at a time when we should be seeing more power pushed down. And I think the only way we're really ever going to have any energy behind an agenda that is about getting this sort of stuff right is if we do have a Labour government at some point in the coming years, because I don't think there'll be much enthusiasm or willingness from the UK government to really start to talk about some of these really difficult issues of reforming the centre that would really involve them handing a lot of power away. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Martin. And we're going to take a sort of final question from an online participant, John Newman. I'm just going to turn on your microphone.
Hello?
Hello, John, we can hear you.
Hi there. Hi there. I'd like to ask, whether or not a system of devolution comparable to that in Scotland and Wales can be achieved in England, because at the moment it just seems like a confusing patchwork.
Thank you, John, for that really insightful question. So, whether we can have comparable sort of devolution to that Scotland and England. And just to, the panelists, in responding to John's questions, if you could just also summarise your general thoughts as well, and sort of closing remarks with that. So we're going to, first of all, turn to Martin.
Yeah, just on John's question, I'm relatively relaxed about the idea that devolution should proceed at different speeds and in different ways across the UK. I think the needs of different parts, I think there are different needs in different parts of the country, and different parts of the country will want to progress some things over others. And I think because it is, I agree that it is a patchwork, but I don't think we should look to just sort of impose uniformity for the sake of it. This kind of goes back to the point I was making in my remarks earlier, which is, we should start from the point of, powers for a purpose. What's the problem that we want to solve in X locality? And then what are the powers that we need? And that could be very different in the Highlands of Scotland to how that might play out in the middle of London. And the UK Constitution has always been fairly flexible at incorporating sort of quirks, and it's never really been very uniform. And I don't think we'll ever really get into a situation of a written constitution to nail a lot of these things down. So I think we need to just be a little bit more comfortable about things moving at different speeds. And I do agree with a lot of what Andy was saying during his remarks about a federalist system. I think we can have a federalist system as well that doesn't involve uniformity. So if you look at the Canadian system, for example, Quebec has a very different set of powers to Alberta or British Columbia. That doesn't stop then all the premiers being treated as equals with the federal government. So there has been an argument in the past that you can't have a federal system where 85% of the population are in one nation. I don't agree with that. I think you can have a system that has the principles of federalism, even if things are moving at slightly different speed. And I'll just just to wrap up my remarks for the day, it's been a really interesting session. I think I would just probably repeat what I said earlier on, which is keeping an eye on purpose, and also not losing sight, especially as this debate develops in England, not losing sight of the centre, and making sure that as we devolve more down, we're still thinking about how we work closely together, whether that's as regions of England or as nations across the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Martin, for those remarks. And I just want to sort of turn to Andy to get his response.
So very briefly, John, I don't agree with you. I don't think we should have a single, structure that has to work everywhere in England. It will be, I think some parts of the big conurbations are clearly ready to run their own economies and public services much more than we do, and that should happen. And that should be a Labour promise. But that does not mean we impose models on the East of England, the South West, where there's not the appetite. And I think in terms of the next manifesto, we at least need to have a minimal governance framework for the UK, four nations relationship, and what are the sort of visible English structures of government. That probably won't be the last word, but it needs to be a clear sign that we want a settlement that is clear. The pandemic has demonstrated what we have now between the nations does not work.
Thank you, Andy. And just turning to Sarah, just to get your thoughts.
Thanks. Well, as you know, I did argue for a degree of consistency, because to me it is too boxed and piecemeal at the moment. But I think as Martin just highlighted, a federal system and having consistency isn't the same as uniformity. And I think the benefit of consistency, at least, is a degree of transparency that, as Andy's highlighted, we just don't have at the moment. So areas do need to be able to go out there and speak, but where's the overarching plan for this? Either from the red team or the blue team. If there was some kind of 20-year plan, then we could work out what are the formulas that are being used, and that would allow each region to go at their own pace, to develop it based on their residents, but we could all see how that was being done in the public eye to avoid the corruption. So I guess really there's a plea for integrity at the heart of any discussion about devolution that we need to be pushing from our side, because the whole thing at the moment is done in such a corrupt way. And yes, I would just end with a plea for integrity, and also to keep diversity at the forefront of devolution, so that the people representing these areas and also the people involved in the decision making as it's evolved isn't just the same old voices, because otherwise you just end up with the same problems of centralised government but in a devolved way, and that doesn't serve people either. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. And just for the sort of the final thoughts and words from you, Judith.
Yes, so I'm liking the flexible federalism idea, and I think that's absolutely right. And talking to Labour members of local government in Scotland, they will say very clearly that there might be devolution to Holyrood, but there isn't devolution down to the communities in Scotland. And I think perhaps we could learn from the experience in Scotland and make sure that our plan going forward, and that I think Sarah's absolutely right, that there does need to be a plan that we make sure that local authorities, whatever level they're at, are fully included in that and reflecting the needs of their places and their people. And I think I just want to end on a positive note, actually, because I think this presents a huge opportunity for Labour. This is our natural territory, and we need to get a grip of it and get hold of it. And it's urgent, and we need to be on it now and really gaining all of the views and making sure that we have a very clear perspective when we go forward into the next election. And absolutely, the principles of diversity, inclusion, need to be at the heart of this, and recognising this isn't just about shiny infrastructure, it's about investment in skills, in health, in housing, all of those things that have such a detrimental impact on people's lives and their ability to contribute to the well-being of their environment.
Thank you, Judith. And first of all, I just want to start off by asking all of you to give a round of applause for our very insightful thoughts and devolution, some interesting novel ideas as well.